Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet.
This review covers the Sd.Kfz 222 Leichter Panzerspähwagen 4x4 light armored vehicle. It's a 135 scale kit from Tamiya, number 35051. Now the 222 was the second in a series of light armored reconnaissance vehicles. It was designed with a rear engine and four-wheel drive and became the standard light armored vehicle for the German Army for reconnaissance in World War II. It worked well in areas with roads but was impaired by off-road service. Now the Tamiya kit was first produced in '75, and this was the '88 rebox that I'm building, but it was also reissued in 2003 and again in 2007 with figures and a motorcycle. It also has some photo etch and metal gun barrel parts. Now it's out of production, but they're still easily available online or in hobby shops. The finished kit will measure 5.5 inches long, 2.5 inches wide, and 3.5 inches high. There's 91 parts in the kit, 4 gray sprues, and a piece of string for cable, and some fabric mesh for wire screens. We'll be using mostly liquid cement for the construction, sometimes super glue, however, and please remember to follow the manufacturer safety and use guidelines when you're using any of the products that you see or hear used in the review. Now the decals are pretty nice, but make sure that they're intact. Some of the older kits decals did not survive, so just make sure that they look good before you use those. And we'll be starting with construction of the chassis. As in most kits, you'll find some parting lines and ejector marks and pin marks, so clean those up all along the way as you find them. Now glue the chassis parts in place on the lower hull and keep them true and square so that all the tires touch the ground at the same time. Be sure to place the brake rod that's C16 with the long side on the left frame rail. Glue the doors and the toolboxes to the lower hull. Finally, the front bumper is glued to the front of the lower hull. Now I used some thin cement for this, and I'll be using some super glue as I mentioned later on. There's inner door details if you wish to pose the door open here, but there's no interior provided in the kit. Locate these parts from the kit and to assemble the wheels, and the tires are molded in plastic. The wheel backing plates are lettered A and B for specific sides, and they'll be visible after assembly. So be sure not to get any glue on the brake backing plate during assembly if you want the wheels to rotate. The instructions aren't real clear on when to use the glue, so make that your warning. After you assemble the wheel halves, add the wheel covers to the assembled wheels, and you can see the progression of steps in these few photos. Round up the parts to finish the chassis and the wheel attachments. And there's a special instruction in a sidebar here for the front hook placement that you need to pay close attention to. I've found a sink mark at the top of part C2, that's the front underguard panel there, and I just used some of my favorite putty to fill the sink and sand it down. Now we can finish the assembly of the suspension and the chassis, and some of the parts are pretty small, and you'll need to pay attention to which part goes where according to fit and instructions, but the fit of the parts is very nice, and if you use some extra thin cement it works well. If you put on too much adhesive, it will actually interfere with the close fit of some of the pieces. So make sure that the wheels are true when you're gluing the lower control arms and wheels in place. If you don't, are able to do it by eye, then you may want to make a jig so that they all set in the right position. Now I didn't glue the spare tire in place yet. I wanted to paint under that first, so we'll leave that off until later. Now we'll use these pieces to assemble the 20mm machine gun. Gather the gun and the mounting parts, and don't glue parts A38 and 39 to the gun. Just glue the parts together to each other and then not to the gun. It must be able to rotate upward to finish the assembly. and the instructions aren't real clear on gluing points, etc. So just use that caution and glue the remaining parts of the gun together. These pieces will be used next to finish step 4, so gather the MG34 and the rest of the gun platform, then glue the parts shown as you see them here and place the finished assembly in the lower hole on its locating points. And I used a pin vise and a 1/64 drill bit to hollow out the gun barrel. Here's the sub-assembly as it progresses along, and we're going to add that once again to the platform where it's mounted. So you can see here between the two sections that it gets mounted, and then of course it will be enshrouded later on with a turret. Next we can assemble the upper hull using these parts, and there's some sink marks on parts A3 and A6, the front visors. So again, putty those and sand them smooth to get rid of those. The doors and the visors attach pretty well, but you'll have to pay attention to keep the headlights in proper orientation. Now, all the parts were glued with some thin cement, and I left off the shovel, that's B1, and the tail cover, part C18, as an optional part, so I could detail paint those. And the gas cans were also, part 29, were optional. At step 6 in the instructions, we'll gather the parts together for the fender assembly, and you should do some test fitting here to fit the fenders with the mud flaps to make sure that there's enough clearance for the tires after you've assembled that sub-assembly. On the left front fender, be sure to place a pole on the outside and the black light on the inside of the fender, and then glue all of the other parts on as shown, and all of the parts have good locating points, so it shouldn't be any issue. Again, we use thin cement and keep the poles at correct angles with each other, symmetrical on each side until the glue sets. Sidebar at step 6 shows how to assemble the figure, and you're best off to just test fit the pieces to see how they fit best, and as they fit into their contours and sockets, etc., that's how he will align nicely in the vehicle. So use some thin cement and kind of feel that into position, and go ahead and assemble him. And now we'll get to some concrete assembly with the upper and lower hull. So grab those pieces, the sub-assemblies, along with the smoke dischargers, and test fit the upper and lower together, and then glue them together and sand the seams and the sides as needed to make sure that everything is smooth and crisp. Now, the smoke dischargers do not have a positive location, so place them about an 1/8 inch above the front bumper, or just enough room to slip the cable in later, and then in between the bumper and the canisters. In this version of the kit, there are templates to copy to cut out the wire mesh for the top of the turret there, and they have right and left side, and they're a mirror image, so you really only need one set of templates to cut out to use. So cut out the mesh with some sharp scissors or photo etch shears, and then using the templates, keep the mesh square with the right angled edges, and then glue the mesh into the frame with some super glue, keeping those right angled edges true. And then take your time with this step, and there's extra mesh if you'll need it if something goes wrong. But the newer kit, like I said, will have photo etch parts for this, but this is how they were done in the old days. For step 9, you'll need these pieces to construct the turret halves, the sight door, the hatch, the visors, antenna mount mesh covers, and a stretched sprue antenna. So to stretch the sprue, you just take a lighter and heat a piece of round sprue, heat the center until it melts, and then pull the sprue apart until it's the thickness that you want it. Remove any pressure, let it harden, and you've got stretched sprue. I waited till later to apply the antenna and the mesh covers on top, however. Now there's a cable that's made from the cable ends C3 part there, and a piece of string provided that's about 15 centimeters long. There was enough string for another cable, 11 centimeters long, and 2 more ends, C3. So I made 2 cables, painted them dark silver, and weathered them with a little brown wash, and they're shown here attached to the front hooks and wrapped around the front bumper in a later assembly. Now this armored car will start to come together quickly. So gather up all the pieces that you see here, and we'll be using those sub-assemblies to add the turret and the exhaust parts and the toolbox and the fender sub-assemblies to add to the main body. So with the parts at hand, you'll need to do a little test fitting to make sure you find the glue points. Then glue the fenders onto the attachments and make sure they're properly aligned to avoid the gaps and some tire rub. And glue on the exhaust parts. They've got some nice gluing points, but they do have a little wiggle room, so make sure they're symmetrical. Attach the toolbox to the left side of the vehicle, and the instructions, they say the right side. It depends on your perspective. I call it right or left as I was sitting in the driver's seat. So I left the turret and the mesh off and sprayed black Stenol Res primer over the entire model with an Iwata airbrush. Then I fixed any imperfections that I found, sanding, putty, etc., and primer. After I was happy with the repairs, etc., and the primer had a nice even look to it and dried thoroughly, I airbrushed on some Tamiya dark yellow and detailed the rear engine cover with a little black wash to highlight that mesh, etc. While the main body was drying, I painted the figure's face and hands with some shades of skin color to help with some shadowing and exposure. His eyes are white with brown pupils, and the uniform is painted dark gray with silver emblems and a black wash to show use. Now the belt is dark brown with a silver buckle. The boots are flat black, and I just used a ultra fine red brush to paint the details. We'll work on some final detailing here, and I hand painted the gun and the platform gunmetal. The seats are khaki, and I added some silver to the gun pieces to exhibit wear. Now place the turret in place facing straight forward, and glue on the tail cover with some super glue. Next, sprayed on some red, brown, and a camouflage pattern with the airbrush, and painted the tires a rubber black color. Then I painted the shovel a dark silver and wood for the handle, and spare tire was a canvas tan cover, and then I'll place them on the model near the finish. Next, I glued the right side mesh in the closed position with some super glue, and placed the figure in and left the mesh in place open for the figure's hand using some super glue. Next, you place decals on the model, and there's different divisional and tactical markings. I went with a Recon for tank division, and the Africa Corps marking does use swastika, which can be offensive, so you might not want to do that. It's up to you. I did not use a gloss coat before placing the decals, and warm water and a setting solution with a final coat of decal solvent left the decals nicely in place. After they dried, I gave the entire model a coat of clear flat, and then I added some scratches and washes and rust for weathering. And where and how much is a matter of your preference, depending on what you're trying to portray. Normally, construction would be completed here if you place the shovel into position and the spare tire with some super glue and weather those along with the rest of the motif you're trying to portray. But I like to use some dirt for weathering, and so I use some fine dirt from around my area, and I mixed it with some glue and water, and then I place wood glue water mixture on a piece of plastic, and I pile of dirt on a piece of cardboard. Then I drive the vehicle through the glue, and then on a paper towel, and then through the dirt. Now, with a paintbrush, then you can place the glue where you want the dirt to stick, like inner fenders and sides, and then sprinkle the dirt out on those places. Now you airbrush a flat clear over the model to seal the dirt in place. And if the dirt is not quite the correct color, you can paint it because it shouldn't move. And it can even be gloss coated to mimic some wet mud or something. It adds a nice realistic effect. And then don't forget to super glue in and paint the antenna as your final construction item. Well, there you have it. This nicely detailed kit goes together very well, but it has some really small parts and difficult assemblies, so it's not really for the beginner. But it goes together nicely with liquid cement. It can be detailed as much as you like, and it makes for a pretty darn good display, even a diorama of sorts, because it has a figure with it. You could also replace the stretch sprue with, say, some 5/1000 filament, that's available at hobby shops for a safer alternative there for youngsters, but they would need some help putting this together. On the other hand, the price point is great. You can find these quite reasonably, and they've been building or making these for a long time. So there's a lot of them out there to be had, even though they're not in current production. Maybe they'll do it again, however. So if I were you, I'd find one and put it on my shelf. I hope you like this step-by-step premium scale model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, but you can find us on Facebook and at our website right on replicas.com. Thanks.